We are delighted to welcome Celeste Ng to Politics and Prose. Her new book, Little Fires Everywhere, is an illumination on American life in the planned perfect suburb of Shaker Heights, Ohio. When drifting artist Mia and her teenage daughter Pearl move into town, they disrupt the life of their landlords, the Richardson family. Set against the backdrop of a public custody battle and a facade of perfection, the two families collide, bringing to light secrets that they would rather stay buried. It is rebellious free will against the status quo, and the result is a beautiful, realistic, oftentimes funny, and fast-paced family drama. Celeste will be joined in conversation by Nicole Chung, the managing web editor of Catapult, and who is currently at work on her first book. So please join me in welcoming Celeste Ng and Nicole Chung to Politics and Prose Bookstore.
Hi, thank you all for coming. I don't know which way I should face, so maybe I should just like gently rotate throughout the whole reading. Hold on. Okay, now I'm prepared. Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you to Politics and Prose for inviting me. This is a bookstore that I was a fan of even before I wrote my first book. And then when I came for the paperback tour of my first novel, Everything I Never Told You, I got to read here, which was a really special thing, so I'm really happy to be back. And most of all, thank you to Nikki for doing this event with me, and thank you to all of you for coming. I'm so thrilled to be here to talk to you about Little Fires Everywhere. The novel takes place in 1997 in Shaker Heights, Ohio, which is a suburb of Cleveland, and is also my own hometown. I lived there from age 10 until I went away to college. The city's official motto is, "Some communities just happen, the best are planned." So that maybe tells you a little bit right off the bat about just sort of what kind of community it is. And let me say, too, that I loved growing up there. I'm still very fond of the community. It was a really wonderful place to grow up. Shaker Heights is actually one of the first planned communities in the United States. It was incorporated in 1912, and it prides itself on being very progressive, being racially integrated, and being very idyllic. And it is actually all of those things. My parents decided to move there when my dad got a job in Cleveland because it was known for being racially diverse. And in Cleveland, that's mostly talking about black and white, but it was close to 50-50 black and white. And for comparison, the community that's sort of directly to the south of it, Warrensville Heights, is about 97% black. And the community to the east of it, which is called Beechwood, is about 91% white and like 9% black and other. So Shaker Heights being sort of even close to sort of 50-50 black and white was kind of unusual. The flip side of the community sort of being so meticulously planned is that everything is planned. So, for example, if you don't mow your lawn often enough, the city will come and mow it for you, and then they will charge you because they mowed your lawn. For a long time, you could only paint your house certain colors depending on what classification of house it was. So if it was a Tudor house, there were certain colors of brown and cream that you were supposed to use. And if it was a French house, then there were certain other colors you were supposed to use. And the whole principle of it was that they wanted the street to be harmonious. They didn't want any of the colors to sort of clash with each other. So they didn't want everything to be the same, but they were sort of doing this planned diversity in the houses, just as they sort of did in the community. The best example that I can give that sort of sums up Shaker Heights has to do with garbage day. So on garbage day, you are not supposed to put your garbage on the front curb like pretty much everybody else in the country does, because that makes the street look really messy to have garbage on the street. So what you're supposed to do instead is you leave the garbage at the back of your house where nobody else can see it. And the city has a fleet of tiny little garbage trucks that are about the size of a golf cart, maybe a little smaller, and they go really fast. And they zip down every person's driveway on garbage day, and they pick up the garbage in the back, and then they carry it up to the front, and they put it into the big dump truck so that there's never messiness on the street. So I thought this was normal until I went and lived on my own, and I realized that everyone thought this was incredibly weird, which it kind of is. So as you can tell, this is a community that really values order and rules, and it's also a very idealistic community. They have this sort of ideal that they want the community to be beautiful, they want it to be racially diverse, and so they have really been working on this in their sort of city policy since the 50s. And in the novel, as you heard, there's a family, the Richardsons, that sort of embody all of those ideals. The matriarch, Mrs. Richardson, really believes that as long as you follow the rules, you can avoid everything that is unpleasant and unseemly or disastrous. And it probably doesn't surprise you to learn that that is not actually the case. So the book actually opens on a very bad day for the Richardsons. The little fires of the title become literal for them. So because we're going to be in conversation, and hopefully we're going to talk about race and adoption and all kinds of stuff, I'm going to keep the reading short. So I'm just going to read you the very first few pages of the novel so that you can get a feel for the book. And since it's the very beginning, you don't really need to know anything. Everyone in Shaker Heights was talking about it that summer. How Isabel, the last of the Richardson children, had finally gone around the bend and burned the house down. All spring, the gossip had been about little Mirabelle McCullough, or, depending on which side you were on, Mei Ling Chow. And now, at last, there was something new and sensational to discuss. A little after noon on that Saturday in May, the shoppers pushing their grocery carts in Heinens heard the fire engines wail to life and careen away toward the duck pond. By 12:15, there were 4 of them, parked in a haphazard red line along Parkland Drive, where all 6 bedrooms of the Richardson house were ablaze, and everyone within half a mile could see the smoke rising over the trees like a dense black thundercloud. Later, people would say that the signs had been there all along, that Izzy was a little lunatic, that there had always been something off about the Richardson family, that as soon as they heard the sirens that morning, they knew something terrible had happened. By then, of course, Izzy would be long gone, leaving no one to defend her, and people could, and did, say whatever they liked. At the moment the fire trucks arrived, though, and for quite a while afterward, no one knew what was happening. Neighbors clustered as close to the makeshift barrier as they could and watched the firefighters unreel their hoses with the grim faces of men who recognized a hopeless cause. Across the street, the geese at the pond ducked their heads underwater for weeds, wholly unruffled by the commotion. Mrs. Richardson stood on the tree lawn, clutching the neck of her pale blue robe closed. Although it was already afternoon, she had still been asleep when the smoke detectors had sounded. She had gone to bed late and had slept in on purpose, telling herself she deserved it after a rather difficult day. The night before, she had watched from an upstairs window as a car had finally pulled up in front of the house. The driveway was long and circular, a deep horseshoe arc bending from the curb to the front door and back, so the street was a good 100 feet away, too far for her to see clearly, and even in May, at 8 o'clock, it was almost dark besides. But she had recognized the small tan Volkswagen of her tenant, Mia, its headlights shining. The passenger door opened, and a slender figure emerged, leaving the door ajar. Mia's teenage daughter, Pearl. The dome light lit the inside of the car like a shadow box, but the car was packed with bags nearly to the ceiling, and Mrs. Richardson could only just make out the faint silhouette of Mia, the messy topknot perched at the crown of her head. Pearl bent over the mailbox, and Mrs. Richardson imagined the faint squeak as the mailbox door opened and then shut. Then Pearl hopped back into the car and closed the door. The brake lights flared red, then winked out, and the car puttered off into the growing night. With a sense of relief, Mrs. Richardson had gone down to the mailbox and found a set of keys on a plain ring with no note. She had planned to go over in the morning and check the rental house on Winslow Road, even though she already knew that they would be gone. It was because of this that she had allowed herself to sleep in. And now it was 12:30, and she was standing on the tree lawn, in her robe, and a pair of her son Trip's tennis shoes, watching their house burn to the ground. When she had awoken to the shrill scream of the smoke detector, she ran from room to room looking for him, for Lexi, for Moody. It struck her that she had not looked for Izzy, as if she had known already that Izzy was to blame. Every bedroom was empty except for the smell of gasoline and a small, crackling fire set directly in the middle of each bed, as if a demented Girl Scout had been camping there. By the time she checked the living room, the family room, the rec room, and the kitchen, the smoke had begun to spread, and she ran outside at last to hear the sirens, alerted by their home security system, already approaching. Out in the driveway, she saw that Tripp's Jeep was gone, as was Lexi's Explorer, and Moody's bike, and, of course, her husband's sedan. He usually went into the office to play catch-up on Saturday mornings. Someone would have to call him at work. She remembered then that Lexi, thank God, had stayed over at a friend's house last night. She wondered where Izzy had gotten to. She wondered where her sons were, and how she would find them to tell them what had happened. So I'll stop there and we'll have our conversation.
Hi.
It's not on.
Hello? Okay, sorry. Okay. I wanted to kind of start, first of all, by talking about just your initial inspiration for this book. If there was maybe a character or a scene or even an image that first came to you, and if you followed that sort of into the story.
So the real inspiration for the book was that I had been living away from home for long enough that I was starting to sort of look back on my hometown with both nostalgia and also sort of a faraway perspective. I think that a lot of people have the experience of thinking that whatever you had growing up was kind of normal. Everybody probably had a life kind of like yours. And as I said, when I moved away, I realized that a lot of things about Shaker Heights were actually really unusual. Both the sort of things I told you about, like the garbage trucks and all of that, but also a lot of really great things, this sort of idealism of the community. I learned, for example, that most schools don't have a race relations group, and that isn't something that's talked about as openly as it was in Shaker Heights. In Shaker, in 5th and 6th grade, the students all undergo basically like a race awareness training. It's run by high schoolers. So there's a race relations group at the high school. They come to the 5th and 6th graders and sort of talk with them, like what is a prejudice? What's discrimination? How do you resist peer pressure? A lot of that stuff. And then a lot of times the 5th and 6th graders grow up, go to the high school, and then come back and train the next generation. And I didn't realize that was unusual. So a lot of things like that I started to see sort of how unique that community was. And I wanted to write about that place. I was really fascinated by how that kind of almost kind of hippie progressive inclusiveness, which I loved, was in tension with the kind of like stickler for rules kind of attitude that the city has, and those things go together. And so I started thinking about a family that might embody that ethos, and that's how the family sort of arose.
So what are some of the bigger challenges, I guess, of writing about a place that you love and know so well, where I assume you still know people? Was that more difficult than you expected? Was anything about that really surprising to you?
It was really, frankly, terrifying because, if you write about a real place, your readers might have their own feelings about that place, especially if you're writing about a small place. If you're writing about somewhere like New York or LA, you can kind of trust that your readers, might go to New York or LA and they'll form their own experiences and they can kind of weigh what you say against their own experience. If you're writing about a place like Shaker Heights, which is not a huge tourist destination, there's a certain amount of responsibility that I felt to try and be fair to that place. At the same time, I wanted to sort of be honest about the things that I loved about it, and then also the things that I see as quirky or the blind spots that it has. Looking out at the audience, I see a few friends who grew up in Shaker Heights, and I'm waiting till the question and answer session for them to stand up and tell me what I got right and what I got wrong. I'm pretty sure there will be, mistakes that people are going to tell me about when they're like, it's not South Woodland Boulevard, it's South Woodland Road, that kind of thing. I think the best analogy that I have, though, is it's sort of like writing about like a relative. You know them, you love them, you want people to see them in a really good light, but you also know their quirks, the things they do that are not super great and maybe what their faults are, and so you want to kind of try and be fair in showing them.
So given that you're very familiar with the setting, obviously, like, tell us what your research for this book looked like. I mean, there were probably still things that you had to sort of look up, double check against memory, and then like other aspects of the story that you needed to investigate.
Yeah. So I cheated a little bit on the research, and I set the book at the time that I was in high school. So I was, so a lot of this was sort of fun, sort of nostalgia trip for me. I got to send the characters to places that I went to as a teen and places that I hung out with, with my friends. And so some of it was sort of a matter of kind of looking back at old yearbooks and remembering those things, or talking to my friends and, you know, saying, what songs were in the jukebox again? But I also did want to sort of give a fuller picture than just what my memory was, and I wanted to make sure that I got the details right. And this is where I give a shout out to local history librarians, librarians are great overall, but the local history librarian at Shaker Heights was such a huge help to me. I went in and I said, I'm writing a novel set at this time. And she pulled out issues of the school paper from the years that I was looking at. She pulled out yearbooks and, you know, city newspapers. She pulled out copies of Shaker Magazine, which is the magazine that the city puts out and kind of gives to all the families in the neighborhood, which I only learned literally yesterday is not a normal thing. I thought that every community had a magazine named after itself that highlighted the cool things that its residents were doing. And apparently that's not true. So I tried to sort of keep the details as real as possible because I wanted the world to feel fleshed out. And yay, libraries.
Just shifting to talk about some of the characters in the book. I don't want to give like a lot of the plot away, but I feel like in your first novel, Everything I Never Told You, which is also a beautiful book, you know, the character of the mother is like one of the most memorable characters from that novel for me. And in this book we got many characters, but the four mothers and how their stories like interweave and clash is really what I took away from this more than anything else. And it was interesting. I wonder if you could talk more about how those four mothers sort of interact or don't, and then you know, this larger question of like who deserves to be a mother, which is really sort of what the book is driving at.
Yeah. So there were more mother-daughter pairings in the book than I realized, and I probably should like talk to my therapist or something like that about like, you know, what kind of mother issues I might have. I actually love my mom. She's great. But I think that I'm really interested in the sort of mother-child relationship, and it's sort of this through line throughout a lot of my work, partly because I am a mother myself, and partly because I'm in that kind of weird sandwich spot where, you know, my mom is still around, and I'm sort of relating to her as a daughter, even as I'm trying to relate to my son as a mother. And so I'm kind of looking in these two opposite directions at the same time. And so it's something that I've been thinking a lot about, sort of what it means to be a parent, what you're supposed to try and do for your kid, what things your kid needs to figure out on their own. So I think of the book a lot about as mothers and daughters kind of trying to pair off with each other in different ways, like the difference between the mom that you're born to and the mom that you maybe, or the mother figure that you sort of choose for yourself, or who maybe comes to find you. I think a lot of people have that experience.
I wanted to talk a bit about the adoption storyline. I am adopted, and I always get really nervous sometimes seeing it portrayed. I mean, whether it's like books or TV, just the portrayals, they can be like all over the place. Sometimes it's not always treated as the complicated issue that it is. This was really one of the more like nuanced and like beautiful treatments I've seen of adoption in literature, so thank you for that. Can you talk about why you're so interested in it as a topic and why you used it to power this plot?
Yeah, so I should say first that I was really nervous about giving you the book to read.
I read it a year ago.
Yeah, I gave it to her actually, I think like right after I had sold the book, because I said, you know what, Nikki, I have a transracial adoptee in the book, and it's not that I want you to tell me like, yes, this is the transracial adoptee experience, because I don't think there is such a thing, but I wanted to be sensitive to the fact that that's not an experience that I've had, and I wanted to see if I was sort of even looking in the right directions. And so you served as sort of like a beta reader for me, which is really helpful. Thank you. I think I've always been interested in the idea of sort of being slightly an outsider in a community. So I'm fully ethnically Chinese. My parents came from Hong Kong. But I've had the experience through most of my life of being one of the few people who kind of looked like me. And this is a place where I think Asian Americans, like there's that sort of idea that you're the perpetual foreigner, that you, even if you've lived here forever, you speak fluent English, people look at you and they think, oh, you're not from around here. And so I have always been interested in the ways that sort of people respond to Asianness and how Asians sort of think about that themselves. And in this case, that question where there's a Chinese American baby who's sort of in the middle of this tug of war between her biological Chinese mother and the white couple that's adopted her, I felt like sort of highlighted all of those issues.
So a lot of the conflict kind of revolves in the book around like the adoption and sort of where people in the town fall, like pro or con. And I was really interested in the fact that we hear a lot of white characters in the book sort of talk as though they're colorblind, or they'll say, well, it really shouldn't matter. But like their own words and actions sort of betray that it is a really important thing, and that they really aren't colorblind. Were those scenes difficult to write? Were you worried about them? Was there, I don't know, and why did you in particular want to tackle that topic in this story?
Well, this is, if any of you are on social media, especially Twitter, you know that race is something that I think about a lot. And I didn't intend to be any kind of like racial spokesperson, and I don't want to be. But race is something that I think is an interesting topic to discuss. And I remember in the 90s, when I was a teenager and even into college, I feel like the way that at that time we sort of talked about being race conscious was to say, I don't see race. And I think that now we sort of understand why that's a problematic stance to have, because you're overlooking a lot of experience and context and, background that is actually kind of important. And so that's sort of what happens with the parents in the novel, that they're trying to sort of figure out, how do I give this child access to a culture that isn't really accessible to me? I feel that way sometimes even about myself. Like I have now a biracial son, and I'm sort of thinking, well, okay, I don't speak Cantonese, so how am I going to get you to feel attached to Chinese culture? Okay, I got to teach you how to use chopsticks. And I'm like, okay, and my mother is sort of helping, because she's like, here's a Chinese children's book. He can learn some characters, and he loves it. Since I don't speak Cantonese, I got like a Cantonese like children's app, which I was trying to learn how to speak Cantonese, and my son took my phone and actually is better at this now than I am. But it's this sort of thing where I'm like, how do you give your child access to those things that you probably don't even think that you're imparting?
Yeah, there's this really powerful scene in the book. Again, I'm sorry, I don't want to give too much away, but the courtroom scene where they're discussing the adoption, but in terms of like race and representation. And the question is, how will this child, if she's brought up in a white family, where and how will she see herself? Yeah. And like, how will you provide those opportunities? Is this even something you thought about? And I read so much into that, like just echoes of like my childhood, but also as a parent, looking for that representation for my children now. Is that kind of why, I don't know, why you wanted to include that, and is that something you experienced too?
Yeah, we're both parents of biracial children, and it gets kind of tricky now to sort of go, okay, how am I going to show you yourself in a picture book? There's not a lot of picture books about East Asian children, let alone about sort of biracial children. And so I was really lucky that my own mom, I think, was aware of this well before I even knew what she was doing. But she basically, in my childhood and adolescence, if she saw a book that had Asian people in it, she would buy it for me. Didn't matter who it was by. Basically, if there was a book written from, about like 1982 to about like 1999 that had an Asian person in it or was by an Asian person, like she had it. And now I kind of realize sort of why she was doing that. Likewise with dolls. There's a little section in the book where they talk about what kind of dolls are available for the children, is that my mom was kind of always on the lookout for an Asian doll for me, and she couldn't find one. There was a very brief period where there was an Oriental Barbie, which is about as, it's what it sounds like. I don't know how to explain it.
Sorry, it was called Oriental Barbie.
It was called Oriental Barbie. There's a little part in the novel, so if you read the novel, you'll see there's a little part where they discuss the Oriental Barbie, and the description of it is real, or you can Google it. Everything's available on Google. But where they talk about it, and she says, hello, I am from the Far East, where people buy spices in open markets. And this is so often, I think, the choice that you find is it's the choice between, I think you said this, is bad representation or no representation. And when I was like 12, the American Girl dolls were a really big thing, and I really wanted one. And my mom said no, first because these dolls are ridiculously expensive, but second because she was like, none of these dolls looks anything like you. And in about 1995, I think they finally came out with the kind of like Just Like Me, I don't remember what they're called, but the dolls that are supposed to look like you, and you can pick the hair color and so on. And they had an Asian doll, and my mom actually bought it for me because I think she was so excited, even though I was 15 and I was kind of too old for dolls. But it was really important to her to buy it, and it was kind of important to me to have it. So I actually still have this doll in my house. But so it is something that I'm sort of struggling with as a parent, and I'm recognizing now how much my mom struggled with it as a parent.
Definitely, like it takes a lot of extra effort. I'm totally that person who buys every single book I can find, and I think my parents kept like the Asian baby doll they ordered for me special. Like they had to order it from
I'm impressed that they could find one.
Too.
Yeah.
It showed up also when I was too old for dolls, but like they kept it. My kids have it now. I think we'll do like one more question and then open it up.
Okay.
I kind of just want to ask a question, even more than the racial differences between these families. In the book, there's a lot of interesting tension around like class differences.
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed this much more like with this novel than with your first. What was it like sort of, again, looking at that through the lens of like, you're from this place?
Yeah, I feel like race and class, especially right now, we're talking about them as if they are two separate issues, and they really overlap. I mean, they're not the same thing, but there's a big overlap between those two things. So I grew up in what I think of as a normal-sized house in Shaker. It was like a 3-bedroom house. There were really big mansions that were beautiful. And then there was also, particularly along one very long road, there were a lot of what we call duplexes, so 2-family houses. And I had 2 sets of aunts and uncles who lived in a duplex. One sat on the top and one sat on the downstairs floor. And so I was really familiar with what those houses were like. And again, it didn't strike me until I moved away that it was strange how the community handled them. So even though it's a 2-family house, the rule basically is that they can only have one front door. They can only have one mailbox. They can only have one light. Basically, they want it to one like front door light outside on the house. Oh, they're not that mean. You can have as many lights inside as you want. So basically the idea is that they wanted the 2-family houses to look like a 1-family house from the outside. And the reason for, and you're like, that's kind of weird. And it is. The reason for it, though, is sort of based in that kind of idealism, which is that they wanted to kind of downplay class differences. They didn't want it to be obvious who was living in a 2-family house and therefore probably renting and who owned their house. And so the idea was that from the street, everybody's house just looks like a house. And you can see how that kind of goes both ways, right? It's like saying, well, we want to reduce the stigma, so we're going to pretend that everybody is living in a single-family house. And it was something that didn't strike me until I moved away again, and I live in Boston now, where 2-family houses are super obvious from the outside. And occasionally you get houses where clearly the neighbors don't agree, and the house is 2 separate colors. And it occurred to me that class is really inextricably tied into these sort of questions about race, and it plays into the adoption case as well. So when I started writing about race, because that's a subject close to me, class came into it. And we're opening up for questions.
So.
Okay. This is the intimidating part, because if you want to ask a question, you have to get up, which is like way scarier than normally. Okay, we'll go over here, and then we'll go over here.
Thank you both, and thank you. You're such great activists and advocates in your social media, and it's great. So thank you. My question is, this book, which is one of the few this year where I just can't stop thinking about the characters and sort of what happens to them beyond the book. And I'm curious, as an author, do you have a vision of what that is for them, or does their story for you sort of stop where the book ends?
Can you all hear that in the back? Okay. For me, I have a very rough idea of what happened to them. And if you sat down and you asked me questions like you said, where is Izzy right now? I could think about it and I would have a guess. But for me, I know the story that's here, and I know sort of what they might do in the way that if you know somebody really well, like your brother or your sister or your best friend, you can imagine, oh, if they were in this situation, I know what they would do. That's the kind of knowing that I think I have about the characters. I'm not holding out on you, in other words, and holding back the ending. Great question. Yeah.
Great. Thank you both so much for being here and for being wonderful Twitter follows. So I grew up in the Midwest in a more, I guess, when you think of Midwest town, that sort of not a planned community, not a community that strives for racial diversity. So I'm just interested in hearing, Celeste, your perspective of how that influenced your idea about race and being Asian American, being in this place where you were one of the only Asian people, you said one of the only people that looked like you, but it was also a community that was trying to be more race conscious and more aware of those things.
Yeah. So it's a great question. So when I moved to Shaker when I was 10, I actually made my very first ever Asian friend, who's actually here. I'm not going to point at her. But anyway, so I think it actually really helped me to be in a community where we were at least aware of race, even if there were only a handful of Asians there. We were talking about race, and we were sort of trying to figure out how we could get different groups to understand each other. The fact that that was even something that got discussed was, I think, made a space for that kind of conversation. At the same time, because we tend to think about race as black and white in this country, I felt always like I was one step outside of that. I think it was junior year of high school, there was a really big controversy because the school newspaper published some statistics about how black students and white students were achieving or not achieving on test scores. And it was a huge rift in the community that I think did bring people out, and we had a lot of open forums and discussions about this. And I really credit the community for being able to have those discussions. And I think that was something that I learned to be less afraid to talk about race in some ways.
Thank you. I grew up in a planned community, Columbia, Maryland. I don't know if anybody's from there, but nearby. And I loved it. I loved growing up there as a kid for all the same reasons that you're talking about. But people say, would you ever move back? And I'd be like, no way. And for all the same reasons that you're saying, this kind of, cookie cutter kind of we had interfaith centers. We didn't have churches. Everybody had to have the same color of their house. It was the same deal. You had to be part of the Columbia Association. And I felt that really limiting. And now I live in Tacoma Park, and it's the same but crazy. But I always am struck by the question of, would you ever move back? And I'm wondering what that answer is for you.
So the answer for me now is no, mostly because I'm settled somewhere else. I know a lot of people from high school who've moved back, and I kind of envy them in a lot of ways. Their kids are now going to the elementary schools where we went, and that's kind of special. And a few of the teachers are still there, which is amazing. And that is kind of a special thing to be able to pass that on. And it's still known for having really great schools. But I think I wouldn't move back, largely because I don't want to go back to Cleveland. Even though Cleveland, I think, is sort of entering this sort of renaissance. But the truth is that I now live in a place that has a lot in common with Shaker Heights, which is Cambridge, Massachusetts. It definitely does not have the same sort of regulations about what you can do. Cambridge's whole thing is no, be free. It's a little bit like Berkeley in that way. But it does have a similar sort of community spirit. The population of Cambridge is really proud to be progressive, and the people are very upfront about their politics and about trying to be inclusive, and trying to be very sort of outwardly focused. It's a very international community, and so they're always sort of thinking about how are we going to make the world better? What are we going to do to try and be an example? And for better or for worse, that's now the community that we live in. So in some ways, it's like I've moved to the Shaker Heights that's in Massachusetts instead. Hi, Jitander.
Hi, Celeste. So I was telling some friends about you coming, and they checked the libraries, and apparently you've got your book is on hold by at least 200 people in Montgomery County, and the same in Virginia and D.C., which is good. But that prompted a conversation, and I'm very curious about your perspective on this. This is your second book. The first book, I think, really drew people in, so fantastically from the opening pages, and told a story that was, really haunting. And it also delved into a lot of these issues. It's a diverse story, but it's a universal story. And it seems like, you're here with this book, which has all of us here. We're all very excited about it. How are you feeling, sort of being part of this? It seems like there's a lot of real interest in saying, hey, there are different stories to be told. We want, and we're eager to hear about these stories and these characters and these lives that are not just, as useful as Holden Caulfield was, right? There are all these other things that they're being told now, and you're part of that generation of writers that are sort of coming up. So just curious about your perspective from the second book, and also just, do you feel like you're part of sort of a new movement?
I do. I hope that we're starting to. I think we are starting to see more, for lack of a better term, diverse stories, but stories that are not just about sort of like straight, cis, white, largely men. I feel like there have been a lot of novels recently that are starting to tell, like you said, stories that we haven't gotten to see before, and that have always been there, but that just aren't getting attention. As to how I feel, I feel really honored to be part of that. I feel really humbled, especially when readers will write to me and say, I'm mixed race and I have never seen someone like myself on the page. Like, that's a very, very humbling thing to hear. And I also feel a lot of responsibility, I think, in some ways. This is one of the reasons that I feel like I talk more about race than I did when I started off. Because I feel like if anybody is going to listen to what I have to say, then I want to talk about something important. And I want to kind of share the spotlight and say, you know what, I'm not the only person who's writing these stories. There are all these other stories, and they should get attention too. So I feel like if I find a reader, I hope that, if you like my books, then you go and find like another writer of color or another person who's telling stories that haven't been given a lot of attention, and that I can be sort of like a lens to help find, readers find other people, because I don't know all the stories. The best way, I think, for people to get their stories told is not to have like the next Amy Tan, right? Like, you can only have one, and she's just got to be knocked off the pedestal, and then somebody else climbs up. Don't tell Amy Tan that I just flicked her off the pedestal. But this is the thing. She's done amazing things, and she's actually said the same thing, where she's like, why is this idea that there can only be like one Asian woman writer who's writing the Asian American women story? Really, the truth is, as Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie said, like, there's a problem if you've only got one story, and you need to have many stories. So I hope that my success, honestly, gets publishers and editors to take a risk on stories that before they would have said, no one's going to want to read about a Chinese family. I hope that changes their mind. Yeah.
Hi. So I'm a fellow East Clevelander, although from a town a lot less nice than Shaker Heights. But one of the things...
Which town are you from?
I'm from Mayfield.
Okay.
So not like...
Mayfield is
fine. It's fine. We go to
you have
Shaker
East
for
Coast custard.
We have East Coast custard. I'm right across the street from there, actually. But one of the things that, as someone who's moved to a different city now, I've lived here for 8 years, I'm always really curious about people who are writing stories about, like, specifically Cleveland, and leaving there, and that kind of brain drain that happens where a lot of us leave. And I know I'm personally still very protective of Cleveland and like want to defend it. But I'm very curious about like how you chose to write about the place, and thinking about, I am protective, or you might be protective of this place, but also coming from a slightly more critical lens as being someone who has left that place. I always try to like debate those things, and was wondering how you approached that.
Yeah, I think if you grew up in Cleveland at any point since, I would say, maybe the 50s, you kind of get used to people hearing that and going, oh, Cleveland. they will be like, oh, didn't your river catch on fire? Or they would say, yeah, it was a real shame about the World Series. Or, there's a lot of things where they're basically like, oh, people still live in Cleveland, that kind of idea. So I am very protective of it. And I think I wrote about it mostly because I couldn't not write about it, that sounds like I'm cheating. But for me anyway, when I think about stories, it's usually because I'm trying to figure something out for myself. And so I kept coming back to my hometown, and I kept sort of thinking about my experience there and what it was like, and, trying to make sense of that. And that's sort of the book that came out. And so this might have just been sort of my reckoning with my own sort of hometown roots that it came to. But I hope people think better of Cleveland now. I don't actually know.
I hope so.
Yes.
Hi, I have a question about your writing process behind this book. You have a pretty large cast in this novel. What did you find helpful in sort of organizing, and keeping track of, their relationships as they develop and the sort of network in the community that you created? Thank you.
I didn't intend there to be so many characters. People just kept kind of wandering into the book. And then I realized that they had a role to play, so I had to let them stay. So this is always sort of an eternal question for writers. It's just, how do you keep your storylines straight? How do you keep track of who your characters are? The first answer is that I just had to spend a lot of time getting to know the characters. I think about it as kind of like if you're at a cocktail party, you meet someone, you say, okay, what's your name? Where are you from? Where'd you grow up? What do you do? And then you start moving on to like, well, what were your parents like? Do you have any siblings? And you kind of get to know them. And at a certain point, then you understand them and you know them. And so I had to do that with each of the characters so that I would kind of know what they were doing. And then just as you don't generally get one of your friends mixed up with another friend, it was easy for me to sort of keep the characters apart. Logistically, there's a really great program called Scrivener. It's basically a word processing program, and you can buy it online, but it was designed for writers working on large projects. And so basically you can move parts around, you can split things, you can save all your research in the program. A friend of mine sat down and said, you have to learn to use this, and she was right. So that was part of what I did. I sort of had notes about every character, so I would remember when their birthdays were and all these things. And the last answer is that I didn't always get it right. And this is where I'm really grateful to my editor and my copy editor and all the people whose names don't get to appear on the cover of the book, but who really help make it better. Copy editors are amazing and kind of incredibly anal people. And so they would, my copy editor would send me notes and say, here you said it was Tuesday, but over here it is Wednesday. Please resolve. And then they would say things like, here, Moody's birthday appears to be in June. However, here you say he is this old and he would not be this old. Please resolve. And so basically their job is to go through and comb through and fix all of those things for you. And that's when it really helps to have somebody else's eyes on it, because you can't keep track of it all. Thank you. Yes.
Hi. So I just wanted to ask a little bit about, I know you touched upon this briefly, but how you saw the history of representation for Asian Americans evolve since you've been young. And I know this is a loaded question, and how that will eventually affect your writing, your future writing. I know every book is different, but.
So this is a question, just the whole question of representation, that I feel like we are starting to have a conversation about as a culture. So I'm going to talk specifically about Asians because that's who I mostly pay attention to. Let me start by moving backwards, which is that 2 years ago, this TV show came out called Fresh Off the Boat. And is it 2 years ago? Might be 3 now. Is it 3 years ago? That's great. Well, okay, so the reason that I was really excited about this TV show when it came out was that there aren't really any shows that have Asian families in them. And this was the second show on a major network that had ever had an Asian family at the center of it. The first was a show by the comedian Margaret Cho called All American Girl, which came out, I think, in either 95 or 96. It ran for 1 season, and then it was dropped. And so the fact that it then took until, 2016? Yeah, it's about almost exactly 20 years to have another Asian East Asian family, although Asian of any kind, I think. I mean, we had like Mindy Kaling, but it wasn't about a family. I think that highlighted for a lot of Asians how bad our representation had been, that there are very, very few, to the point where if my husband and I are watching TV, I'm like, there's an Asian person in that commercial. And he gets it. I'm like, there's a mixed person in that commercial. And you have this like radar of finding people because there's so little of it. And I think this is something that we're starting to talk more about again now, especially in terms of movie representation in Hollywood. People are starting to call out films where you're like, that character is supposed to be a Tibetan man, and you have Tilda Swinton playing that character. Why did you change that Asian man into a bald Irish woman? And people are starting to say, why are you afraid to do this? And I think, I hope anyway, that people are starting to notice that this is this blind spot that we have, and we're starting to have more of them. And then to talk in terms of books, I think a similar sort of thing is happening. There have been a number of books that are by Asians or that are about Asians that are doing well. Kevin Kwan had a book a few years ago called Crazy Rich Asians, now being made into a movie, and it's got an Asian cast. They did not turn his Asian people into just like a white family. And the fact that that is unusual is a sign that, like, this is a problem we have to fix. So I'm hoping that this, this will kind of become a trend and that we'll have more of them. As to how it will affect my writing, I don't know. I can't imagine that because it's so far from where we are right now. So we'll meet back here in 20 years and we'll hope that there's more Asian representation, and we'll see.
My sister runs the reading program at the Barnes & Noble in Syracuse, New York, and she thinks you're terrific. But one person I think who really showed us how Asian Americans write is this Thun Nguyen from Vietnam, the Pulitzer Prize winner. Do you have any comments on his work? And
I think he's great. Viet Thanh Nguyen is he's got 2 books out now, right? He won the Pulitzer Prize for The Sympathizer. And he is I really like his work, so I highly recommend it to any of you who are interested in it. He's also just a really smart guy. I have not gotten to meet him personally, and I'm hoping to.
Anybody ever?
He
Popular culture.
Yeah, he's so he was recently on Late Night with Seth Meyers. So if you go and Google Late Night with Seth Meyers, you can see him, and he talks just really eloquently and sharply about, he came as a refugee as a small child, and I'm so happy that he's out there is basically my only comment on his work. I'm so happy that he's out there. I'm so happy that he is writing the work he is, and I'm so happy that he's had success and that he's been recognized for it. I want there to be more of all of that.
The Sympathizer is a real epic about
great.
the whole experience.
Thank you.
So following up on that question, you mentioned earlier that you would like to be a lens for introducing other writers. So if somebody likes your book, who else would you recommend that they read?
How much time do we have left? As a serious question. Okay. Okay, so sorry, I'm just trying to run through my mental library of things to think about, because everybody's story is a little bit different, and I don't want to give the impression that, this is the, read-alike for me. But I feel like there are a lot of people who are writing about sort of, for lack of a better term, sort of East meets West culture clash, but places where we were talking about not an immigrant story, but we're talking about maybe a first-generation family or a second-generation family, and just how they interact. So Gish Jen is an amazing writer who often writes about kind of the intersection of sort of American culture and Chinese American culture. If you like novels, she's got a great book called... this is now when I'm put on the spot. It's messing up. She's got a great collection called Who's Irish, first of all, which is short stories, and a lot of them deal with that. She's got a great novel called Mona in the Promised Land. And I feel like she's been an idol for me for a long time. There are a couple of recent books that have come out. The Leavers by Lisa Ko is one of them. The Wangs versus the World is another great book to look up. And if I feel like the best thing to do in some ways is to start with that, and then to sort of see what Google them and then see what other books kind of come up, because a lot of people, I think, tend to you kind of leapfrog your way from this, and then you move your way to that, and then you move your way to Vietnam and Thun, and you find Julie Atsuko, who's writing about Japanese internment camps and when the emperor was divine, and you kind of spiral out from there. So I think once you start looking, you realize how many of those books are out there. I think often the problem is that we don't know how to start looking, and once you find one, it's easier to kind of keep going. Great.
So you sort of opened the door up for this one. You said you were working things out when you write. So what were you working out when you wrote Everything I Never Told You?
I think that was a book. I guess I should say that book, in case it's not clear, is not autobiographical because I didn't die in a lake. People would ask me that on book tour the first time. They were like, "Is this based on you?" And I was like, "Well, no, because I'm here." I didn't think I needed to say that, but apparently I do. I think for me, I was working out a couple of things. First, I was just trying to sort of figure out how to write about Chinese American culture in a way that felt authentic to me, because as I said, I grew up first in Pittsburgh and then in Shaker Heights. There were not a lot of other Asians around. I don't speak Cantonese, which is my family's dialect. I know food is like the main entry to Chinese culture for me, but we would go to like visit relatives and we're supposed to go to the graves and do things, and I had no clue what we were doing. And so I had always felt a little bit like an outsider. And so when I had teachers say, we should write about, being Chinese, you should write about Chinese characters, I didn't know what I was supposed to be writing. I felt like a fraud writing about those things because I wasn't going to write about, making offerings to the kitchen god because we didn't have that. And so it was sort of for me trying to figure out how I could write about that Chinese culture in a way that felt true to me without me feeling like I was faking it in some way. But writing about just like a generic like Caucasian family would have felt as fake to me. So that's sort of the balance that I was trying to figure out. The other thing that I was just sort of trying to figure out was just sort of how you tell a story about a family. I didn't know how to do that, and I kind of fumbled around until it seemed to work, and then I kind of fumble around with this book until it seemed to work. And I'm probably going to fumble around with a third book until it seems like it's working, or my editor takes it away from me. So,
while she's walking up here, I'll ask you this. You said you liked Euphoria by Lily King, but what else do you like?
Oh, I like many books. So I do like Euphoria by Lily King. It's one of my all-time favorite books. This is where my brain goes blank, and I think, have I read a book before? I have read at least one or two. So I'll tell you some books that I have read recently that I really loved. There's a linked short story collection. I'm thinking of it because I just saw it in the other section, called The Tsar of Love and Techno by a guy named Anthony Mara. His first book, a novel called The Constellation of Vital Phenomena, it was one of my all-time favorites, and I only recently picked up the collection and loved it just as much. It's really beautiful, also really kind of slyly funny book. Takes place in Chechnya and kind of deals with the Chechen-Russian conflict, but it's really about family and loss and trying to reclaim the things that you've lost. I'm really looking forward to Jennifer Egan's new novel, which is called Manhattan Beach. I'm a big fan of her Pulitzer Prize-winning novel and stories called A Visit from the Goon Squad, so I'm looking forward to this new book. That's it. Come talk to me, and I'll just name books after the reading. I'll just name books at you. Yeah.
This question is actually for both of you. So as others have mentioned, you guys are great, both good Twitter follows. And I was just wondering, as you are both kind of notable figures in the Asian American community, how do you handle it when...
Sorry, we both just looked at each other like we are.
How do you handle it when people come to you with questions of like, how do you feel about X topic because you are Asian? And how do you deal with kind of acknowledging that you do have an Asian American experience, but not necessarily like the Asian American experience?
You want to go first?
I'm always surprised anybody like knows who I am or what I do. But just earlier this week, I got an email from someone, and I don't think it was an Asian. I don't really know. It wasn't an obviously Asian name anyway. It was someone for a PR firm, and they wanted to know, was I going to write about this recent study? And it like compiled 6 studies of Asians on television and found, by and large, we're still underrepresented and largely tokenized on television. This is not news. But they're like, aren't you going to write about this? Like, and I was like, no.
Were they soliciting you, or were they just kind of asking?
They're just asking.
So they
like,
weren't
this
saying,
just
would
seems
you
like
write
something-
about this for us?
Oh, no, it wasn't a publication. It wasn't an editor. I love assignments if there are any editors here. It was not an assignment.
She's really good. She really is.
Oh, thank you. No, but I was just kind of surprised. So it doesn't actually happen a lot that people expect, I don't know, that people come to you like as a spokesperson, which I in no way feel qualified for. I mean, in part because I'm adopted. And so, like, I kind of came to being comfortable as an Asian American and learning about my Korean culture in particular as an adult. But yeah, it can feel strange when you're put on the spot in that way. Like, if you've written about one Asian thing, you'll write about all the Asian things, and I don't know, and you won't write about anything else. And I like to write about other things. So.
I also feel vastly unqualified to be any kind of Asian spokesperson, but it does happen to me sometimes, I think, because my first book did really well, and it had to do with some Asian Americans. And what I try to do is to say basically exactly what you said, which is just like, I don't have the experience. Here is my thought on it. If I have a thought on it, I'll tell you what it is. And then I try to point them to other people, because I feel like, again, my job is to sort of like make more seats at the table. And so to say, yeah, I'm sorry, I can't be on your panel on diversity, which is often what I'm asked to do. Like, suddenly, like, I'm the go-to person. If you want like a Chinese woman on your panel, ask Celeste. And I can't do that, and I don't want to do that, and I think that would be really bad. And so what I try to do is I try to point them to other people and say, hey, I can't do that, but you know what? Like, maybe you could talk to these other people, and they also have worthwhile things to say, and kind of remind them, like, I'm not the only one out there. This is a tactic that I learned from the really great writer Roxane Gay, who, if she can't do things because she is one woman and she is asked to do about like a kabillion things a day, she tries to sort of point the person to other people and kind of share the spotlight. And I think that's basically how anybody who's in sort of a marginalized group should do it, is kind of share around the attention. But it's weird. You're right.
There should be many more.
Yeah.
Like
there should just be many more of everything. Great. All right, I think we have time for one more question. Okay. Yes.
So this question again is for both of you. It's partially inspired, Nicole, by the great piece you wrote about Christy Yamaguchi.
My opus.
Yes. And
you should all go find it and read it. She wrote about idolizing Christy Yamaguchi, and it's amazing.
Yeah. And also, Celeste, what you said about people coming up to you and saying, like, I've never seen myself represented on the pages before. I was wondering personally for both of you, when was the first time you felt like you were represented in media or in literature?
I
feel like
sorry.
I was going to say, I feel like our long pause here tells you something, but
Well, it's a little different because I'm an adoptee. Again, not to like harp on that, but portrayals of Asian Americans there's a long way to go. And when you see adoptees like on television or in books, they're usually children. Like, they're never adults. They usually aren't presented with a great deal of autonomy. The issue's not presented in a terribly nuanced way. Celeste, your book might be one of the first times I've seen an adopted character who was born in the U.S. like I was. I'm not from Korea. My birth parents were immigrants. This might be the closest, at least, adoption parallel, which is really weird, that I've seen in literature. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think. I feel like for a lot of my childhood and adolescence, I was kind of like picking at scraps, and it was never quite a perfect match. So we mentioned Nikki's great piece on Christy Yamaguchi. I was really a big Christy Yamaguchi fan, and then a really big Michelle Kwan fan, because she was like the only Asian girl I had seen presented doing something and being really good at it, and that people seemed to like.
Yeah, I liked Sarah Chang too. Like, we could just go down the list of Asian celebrities.
Right. And any time that I saw, like an Asian in a movie, even in a very minor part, I was always really excited. It's even still happening now. Like, I was really thrilled that in Hamilton, Eliza was played by a part Asian actress, Philippa Sue, which like still kind of boggled my mind, and I feel very personally attached to her, because I was like, you kind of look like me in some vague way, and that in and of itself, I feel like is a sign that we need more representation. But I mentioned Gish Jen earlier, and I feel like she writes a lot about Chinese Americans who are born in the U.S. and are, quote unquote, assimilated very much into the culture. And a lot of what her characters go through sort of really rings true for me. But it's it's not, it's not a perfect fit, and I think that's part of why writers often end up trying to write the stories that they don't see. So I hope some of you, if any of you are writers out here, being in the bookstore, maybe you'll be writing those stories too. Thank you all so much. Thank you for coming.